was very familiar with what was happening. And of course, the situation evolved very quickly and it became quite fluid. I don't think anyone imagined the scope or the vehemence. It took everyone by surprise, but it tapped into much broader unease about the nature of Hong Kong's relationship with the mainland and the Hong Kong government's accountability. I think that was really what became clear to me even before I arrived, and certainly after I arrived and started talking to people. The Hong Kong government, and I believe Beijing, and also Washington. No one knew that this was going to happen. It became clear that Hong Kongers were very frustrated. I don't think that you could necessarily paint the protest movement with a single brush. It was not, in my experience, an organized movement with a single leader. It reflected a broad range of concerns that, in my view, revolved primarily around the Hong Kong government's ability to support and preserve the high degree of autonomy that had been promised when Hong Kong returned to the mainland in 1997. And Hong Kongers were very uneasy about the nature of Hong Kong's relationship with the mainland. Given, I think, the degree of, frankly, shock that the Hong Kong government was in, and likely Beijing as well, we saw, sadly, the reaction that occurred after the protests ended in 2020. Beijing was not expecting that scope of anger and frustration among Hong Kongers. And there was a very unfortunate reaction. First of all, the propaganda, the allegations were that somehow there were quote-unquote foreign forces, and the United States in particular, somehow organizing or orchestrating the protests as a way to get back at China during a period where there were great tensions in the bilateral relationship between Washington and Beijing. That was the propaganda and the allegation. To me, anyone on the ground certainly would realize that Hong Kongers know their own views very well. This was an organic protest based on frustration and dissatisfaction with local political conditions. It's an interesting question, the extent to which Beijing believed its propaganda, that in fact the protests were orchestrated by the United States. I believe that there are probably some people, senior people in Beijing, who do believe that, and acted accordingly, because you've seen this since 2020, this rhetorical obsession with national security and idea of instilling quote-unquote stability and an emphasis on, again, quote-unquote patriots governing Hong Kong. I think there are probably other people, certainly in Hong Kong and on the mainland, who understand the true nature of what was happening. To me, this was primarily a protest movement, and I'm talking about the hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers who protested peacefully in the streets during the spring and summer of 2019. They wanted their own government, the Hong Kong government, to listen. They wanted accountability, they wanted transparency, they wanted the high degree of autonomy that they were promised. And to me, that was the driving force behind the protest movement. There was an unfortunate violent fringe of protesters, and the violence was unacceptable. It was condemned by the United States. Unfortunately, that small minority, I think, in the eyes of some, began to characterize the protest movement. But looking back, it's important to remember that the vast majority of protesters were peaceful. If Hong Kong had been allowed to operate according to the terms that were agreed to in the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Hong Kong is part of China, but the one country, two systems allowed for a high degree of autonomy. And if the Hong Kong government had been able to show the accountability, the responsiveness to addressing public concerns about autonomy and about the preservation of one country, two systems, I think that would have significantly reduced tensions and lowered the temperature. Of course, I was in Hong Kong in November for the district council elections. By November, the protests had become increasingly violent, and they had also been going on for months, and the city was under enormous stress. When the results of the district council elections were announced, showing that in fact people who were in the, you could call it either the opposition or the pro-democracy camp, were the big winners, then all of a sudden Hong Kong became very quiet. And to me, that was a reflection of the fact that people just wanted to have their opinions reflected and heard. You know, the system was working. There was an outlet, in this case a political outlet, that helped to calm the situation, at least temporarily. Right now, people tend to use the shorthand of pro-democracy protests, and I had some people who claimed incorrectly that the United States was interested in imposing a US-style democratic system on Hong Kong. That wasn't the case. I think of the protests as primarily driven by a desire for accountability, for an accountable and responsive Hong Kong government. I think that there is a lot of responsibility to go around, and I think it's unfortunate that the Hong Kong government was not able to respond in a way that de-escalated and reduced the tensions, and that led us into the situation that we have now. There were certainly concerns about policing, and we were very focused on the independent investigation into police activity, and we were constantly urging restraint and professional policing and de-escalating the degree of violence. I don't think it's accurate to say that there was rampant police brutality. But there were certainly documented instances of problematic police activity, and that was on a case-by-case basis. Some of those were investigated. I think some of them perhaps were not. Policing became very controversial. It was important to have a process to make certain that there was professional policing, that the police were held accountable, and there was an investigative process. We were constantly engaging with Hong Kong counterparts to advocate on behalf of better policing and a reduction in violence. The Hong Kong government was obviously preoccupied with what was happening within Hong Kong. This was clearly a government under an enormous amount of duress, scrambling to come up with a solution to a situation that was, yes, of its own making. I met Carrie Lam multiple times. I and my team were talking to everyone we could, from the chief executive on down, to stress the importance of maintaining Hong Kong's system and using the existing framework that had worked not perfectly but very well since 1997 in many ways to resolve the situation. I won't try to characterize her reaction. I'll just say that we raised this issue repeatedly with counterparts in Beijing, in Hong Kong, and in Washington, and we're very unhappy not only with what happened, but with the response. Access was sometimes a challenge simply because the government had other priorities. We were very direct and persistent in stressing our priorities. Those included a higher degree of responsiveness within the framework of one country, two systems, and Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy. It was extremely frustrating. Well, it was worse than frustrating. It was unacceptable that there continued to be the propaganda from Beijing, including these efforts to implicate a consulate employee and her family simply for doing their jobs. Diplomats meet with everyone. We meet with pro-government and opposition figures. That's part of the job. The Hong Kong government understands that, or should understand that. The same thing with Beijing. Of course, it was very upsetting to be accused of fomenting a color revolution when, in fact, U.S. policy toward Hong Kong has always been very consistent, supporting a peaceful, stable Hong Kong in accordance with an international agreement that China and the United Kingdom registered at the United Nations. At the time of the handover in 1997, Beijing was looking for American support for this new untested format, and our engagement was very much welcomed. So the United States has always had an important role to play, in addition to our very real interests. As I mentioned, tens of thousands of Americans, also a huge and important business community. And the framework that everyone agreed to was working quite well. When it didn't work for a variety of internal reasons, the United States could have been, in fact, a valuable partner in helping to stabilize and resolve the situation. And in fact, and I think it was given the bilateral tensions between Beijing and Washington in part, that was another missed opportunity. And it ended up creating divisions, unfortunately, between Hong Kong and the United States at the official level that sadly still persist. No, of course not. The United States government, our representatives regularly met with important Hong Kongers to represent American interests and to understand what was happening on the ground. Those included people in the activist camp, also in the government camp, in the pro-Beijing camp. This is something that we have always done, not just in Hong Kong, but everywhere. And unfortunately, it's more of a reflection of the lack of openness and the insecurity prevailing on the Hong Kong side that a meeting in the course of regular diplomatic engagement is somehow twisted and distorted into implying something that it wasn't. All of our meetings were handled in the same way, regardless of who the counterpart was. And again, I think it's much more of a reflection, a sad reflection on our friends in Beijing. So I've spent a lot of time in mainland China. I'm very committed to the U.S.-China relationship. I really enjoyed my time living in China. I am very disappointed in the direction that China has moved in many ways in recent years. I first visited mainland China in the 1990s. That was an era of openness, I think confidence. You could feel the energy and the excitement. There was a genuine desire for engagement. I think for a variety of primarily internal reasons, we're seeing a China that is less confident in the terms of its engagement with the United States and the outside world. And so some of these responses, for example, trailing a diplomatic official while he or she's conducting a meeting, frankly, it's not worthy of anyone. It's activity that we protested strongly. It's not the China that I first knew when I started visiting and living there. No, we requested meetings with the Central Government Liaison Office. They never agreed to meet with us. In the fall of 2019, I traveled to Beijing to meet with the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office. Those meetings were canceled by the Chinese side. I was able to meet with the Foreign Ministry. My main counterpart with the mainland in Hong Kong was the Foreign Ministry office. It really depended on the official. In general, officials who were sanctioned did not want to have contact with us. We would still contact them if there was something that was important to us. There were some people who, even if they weren't sanctioned, did not want to engage with us. Other people were happy to continue to meet with us. There are some people who are committed to engagement. And there are other people, for whatever reason, whether it's their own personal views or their sense of what is more acceptable with the central government, may not be interested in engaging with us. That was my experience when I was there. My regrets are for Hong Kong. My regrets are for the people who are in jail, or who've been fled, or who feel as though they can't speak. We did everything we could, not just for Joshua Wong, but for there are many others. We were very closely engaged with vulnerable people across the board, including Joshua Wong, to look at what the realistic options were. What could we practically do? And one of the tragedies is that in many cases, we weren't able to. I mean, help means preventing people from being unjustly imprisoned and getting them out. In many cases, we weren't able to do that in the new Hong Kong.